In our headlines on this Wednesday afternoon, September 6th. President Yoon Suk-yeol seeks active and broader cooperation with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in a summit today over in Jakarta amid concerns over security and supply chains. Meanwhile, the White House warns of a price to pay by North Korea in the international community if the regime moves ahead with an arms for food agreement with Russia in support of the latter's war in Ukraine. And at the National Assembly, lawmakers opened day 2 of the interpellation of the Yoon administration, with the focus today on diplomacy and defense amid brewing geopolitical uncertainties. We begin today over in Jakarta, where President Yoon Suk-yeol is engaging with his counterparts in the Asean to promote peace and prosperity within the Indo-Pacific amid rampant challenges to rules-based international order. Our senior correspondent Oh Soo-young, who is part of the Presidential Press Corps, files this report.
President Yoon Suk-yeol will seek deeper engagement with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in line with the pledges he made with the United States and Japan at their Camp David Trilateral meeting last month. Attending the annual summit for the second consecutive year, Yoon on Wednesday held a bilateral dialogue with the 10-member bloc and outlined ways to put into action his Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, which pursues freedom, peace and prosperity in the region. First addressing security issues amid North Korea's missile and nuclear threat, territorial disputes and other regional tensions. He proposed strengthening cooperation in the defence industry with greater dialogue, cybersecurity and transnational crimes along with maritime security. Highlighting the dire need to respond to non-traditional security issues such as climate change and public health, the South Korean leader reaffirmed support for the $19 million Korean-ASEAN Methane Action Initiative to bolster the regional bloc's climate response and build up its capacity to produce vaccines and develop treatments for infectious diseases. The meeting in Jakarta marks Yoon's first multilateral conference since the Camp David summit last month, where the leader agreed with his US and Japanese counterparts to coordinate their engagement and development assistance to ASEAN and other Indo-Pacific players.
지난 8월 캠프 데이비드 정상회의를 계기로 한미일 협력의 새로운 시대가 열렸습니다. 한미일 3국은 아세안이 주도하는 지역 구조에 대한 전적인 지지를 바탕으로 각국의 인태 전략을 조율하고 신규 협력 분야를 발굴해 나아가기로 했습니다. 이를 위해 연례 한미일 인도태평양 대화를 발족하고 아세안과 태평양 도서국의 해양 안보 역량을 지원하는 한미일 해양 안보 협력 프레임워크를 새롭게 출범시켰습니다.
Yoon also presented ways to strengthen economic links with the ASEAN, Korea's second-largest export market, with a flagship program to promote collaborations between Korean and ASEAN youth on digital technologies and artificial intelligence. He will later in the day attend an AI festa for the future generation to kickstart such efforts. Seoul will also continue its contribution to the sustainable development of Mekong countries. On that note, the South Korean leader further highlighted Seoul's potential to share its own development experience with many maritime countries, including in the ASEAN, through the 2030 World Expo, which Korea is hoping to host in Busan City. The president looks to further discuss regional cooperation at the ASEAN Plus 3 summit with Japan and China on Wednesday and at the East Asia Summit on Thursday. While Beijing will be represented by Premier Li Chang instead of President Xi Jinping, the South Korean leader hopes to host a trilateral summit along with Tokyo within the year. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News, Jakarta.
Now, Indonesia, for its part, is emerging as an essential economic partner for South Korea, as is India. And both Jakarta and New Delhi mark 5 decades of diplomatic ties with Seoul this year. So given this occasion, my colleague Shin Ha-young covers the prospects of broader market endeavors.
Indonesia and India, where President Yoon Suk-yeol is traveling to for the ASEAN and G20 summits, have emerged as prominent markets amid the rapidly changing global economic landscape. According to the Korea International Trade Association, although the share of South Korea's exports to the two countries is not large, shipments to India rose by more than 20% year-on-year in 2022, while those to Indonesia recorded an increase of 18.6%. India, with a population of over 1.4 billion as of this year, is considered an attractive place for investment and as a production base. In particular, the Make in India initiative by the Indian government, which aims to make the country a manufacturing hub, has led global automotive companies to establish production facilities there. According to South Korea's trade investment promotion agency KOTRA, India is the world's fourth largest global manufacturing hub for vehicles. Both Hyundai Motor and Kia have successfully entered the Indian market through local investments. In 2021, in terms of sales volume in India's passenger car market, Hyundai ranked second with a share of 17%, while Kia came in fourth. Indonesia, on the other hand, is emerging as an economic partner in terms of supply chains and economic security, especially in the electric vehicle and battery sectors. The government and state-owned firms are working on building supply chains, starting with the mining of nickel, a key material for EV batteries, to the production and distribution of batteries. With India and Indonesia both marking their 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties with South Korea this year, economic cooperation is expected to expand in various areas. KOTRA sees EVs and renewable energy as promising areas of demand for both Seoul and New Delhi. The Indian content market, which is expected to reach $31 billion by next year, is also a field that South Korea can focus on. With Indonesia, electric vehicles, battery supply chains, as well as its smart city projects are areas that South Korea can look forward to for further cooperation. 신하영, Arirang News.
Poland is currently hosting one of Europe's largest defense trade shows, and South Korean military technology is taking center stage. Our defense correspondent Choi Min-jung tells us how.
The 31st International Defence Industry Exhibition kicked off in Poland on Tuesday. For the second time, South Korea is participating in Europe's third largest defense trade show as the lead nation. A total of 30 domestic companies are taking part in the exhibition this year, including Korea Aerospace Industries or KAI, Hyundai Rotem, and Hanwha Aerospace. Polish President Andrzej Duda visited the Korean exhibition hall and expressed great interest in Korean-made weapon systems. KAI displayed models of the F-A-50 light fighter deployed in the Polish military, as well as the Kf-21 multi-purpose fighter, which is reportedly set to begin its initial production phase next year.
Because the Kf-21 is in the development stage, we have not been putting much effort into its promotion so far. I believe that this exhibition has become an opportunity for strategic promotion not only in Poland, but also in Europe and the entire world.
KAI further solidified its position in the Polish market by signing an MOU with the state-owned defense firm Polish Armaments Group. This is expected to pave the way for strengthening marketing activities for Korean weapons in other parts of Europe as well. Visitors were also drawn to Hyundai Rotem's K2 tank on display outdoors in between a German Leopard and an American Abrams tank. The South Korean tank is currently being used by the Polish Army.
I can feel a huge improvement to the K2 compared to the T-72 tank I used to drive. I feel an incomparable difference in the propulsion and the performance of the tank. Riding the K2 is fun.
South Korea's unique role in the exhibition is seen as a natural consequence of Poland's large-scale purchase of military equipment from South Korea in 2022. Last year, the two countries signed a landmark defense deal worth a total of $12.4 billion. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
The Biden administration says North Korea will face consequences within the international community should it choose to condone Russia's invasion of Ukraine by sealing an arms deal with the Kremlin. Our Lee Seung-jae has the latest.
North Korea will pay a price if it provides weapons to Russia. That warning was issued by U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Tuesday during a press briefing at the White House.
Providing weapons to Russia for use on the battlefield to attack grain silos and the heating infrastructure of major cities as we head into winter, to try to conquer territory that belongs to another sovereign nation, this is not going to reflect well on North Korea, and they will pay a price for this in the international community.
However, Sullivan said that there were no indications yet that Pyongyang has provided large amounts of weapons to Moscow, but negotiations on the matter are actively advancing. The latest stern warning from the U.S. comes as North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is reportedly set to visit Russia to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin to discuss a possible arms deal. Russia, however, slammed both South Korea and the U.S. for their military cooperation, saying that it goes against the idea of denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. Earlier this month, during the first session of the Preparatory Committee for the 2026 Review Conference of the Parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, a Russian representative criticized the fact that many countries have punished North Korea for violating the NPT, while the UN Security Council adopted several resolutions on the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. However, Russia also noted that the U.S. sent a nuclear-armed submarine to South Korea in July. The representative further criticized the alliance between the two countries, saying that both Seoul and Washington are responsible for the tensions created on the peninsula. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Lawmakers here have launched their interpellation of government officials this week, and on day one, back on Tuesday, Seoul's response to Tokyo's release of radioactive wastewater was brought under scrutiny. Our National Assembly correspondent Lee Si-hoo reports.
The hot topic of Tuesday's government question and answer session was the discharge of wastewater from the crippled Fukushima nuclear power plant. Representatives from the main opposition Democratic Party once again asked the government where it stands regarding the issue.
Japan began releasing nuclear wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant, despite concerns raised by neighboring countries, among others. Is the South Korean government for or against the discharge?
I believe you are surely aware of the government's stance. We do not oppose the discharge if it's done in a way that meets the standards. This thought is the same as that of the past Moon Jae-in administration.
Representatives from the People Power Party decried the DP's stance on the matter, saying that the government and the party will protect South Korea from fake news and horror stories. The PPP also stressed the importance of pushing for one of the Yoon administration's goals, the launch of the Korea Aerospace Administration.
It's an important matter for the future of our country. The bill has to be passed in September in order to establish the administration within this year, so we can become the 7th space power.
On Wednesday, questions will focus on diplomacy and security. Other issues scheduled to be discussed this week are the economy and education. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
Also, the ruling People Power Party and the government are expanding the size and scope of the nation's COVID-19 vaccine side effect compensation. They're offering up to 30 million won, or some $22,000 to families whose loved ones died within 90 days of vaccination and whose cause of death has not been confirmed by autopsy. At present, up to 10 million won is being offered to families of those who died within 42 days. Meanwhile, more research on vaccine safety will be conducted, while more support for medical equipment will also be allocated. A growing number of people here are choosing to tie the knot later. An annual report by Seoul's Family Ministry on this Wednesday shows the average age of first marriages last year was 33.7 for men and 31.3 for women. Now, these latest findings are up 0.3 years for men and 0.2 years for women compared to 2021. They are also the highest since officials began compiling relevant data back in 1990. Also, 148,000 couples got married for the first time in 2022, a drop of 0.6% on year. The popularity of K-pop merchandise is expanding well beyond the fan base of the artists to include the trendy young public. Our Chung Eun-joo explains.
A long line formed in front of the K-pop girl group New Jeans pop-up store even before opening time. People of various ages and nationalities, from teenagers to people in their 30s and foreigners, had been waiting since dawn to enter the store as soon as it opened.
I think my friends know about this too because it was promoted well on social media using the Y2K trend. I came around 6 in the morning and waited to enter.
Loyal fans and the general public alike buy a collection of keychains, stickers, t-shirts, bags, and more.
These days, Y2K, denim, and leather are in fashion, and these are well incorporated. I think many in their 20s these days like new jeans. Their songs are really good.
Coffee brand Starbucks recently collaborated with girl group Blackpink to release products such as drinks, cakes, and mugs. In particular, the Blackpink collaboration tumbler sold out in stores nationwide within a week of release, and their prices tripled on limited edition sales trading sites. The reason for the idol merchandise frenzy lies in the consumption tendencies of Generation Z, who seek limited editions and like to express their individuality. They consider consumption as a form of entertainment by attaching dolls representing their favorite K-pop artists to their bag or sharing their special experiences at pop-up stores on social media. The range of products has also expanded beyond simply consuming the artist's image to incorporating both aesthetics and practicality to stimulate the desire for ownership of products that appeal to collectors. As the idol IP business expands beyond the fandom-focused market to reach the general public, it's anticipated that the scale of the merchandise industry will grow even larger in tandem with the growth of K-pop. 정은주, Arirang News.
In other news, Seoul and Incheon this past Tuesday evening marked their first tropical night for the month of September in almost 9 decades. According to relevant authorities, cities including Cheongju, Yeosu and Jeju also experienced a tropical night from late Monday to early Tuesday. Seoul, for its part, marked its 4th September tropical night since 1904, when the country began collecting such data. A tropical night indicates temperatures hovering at 25 degrees Celsius or above from 6 in the evening to 9 in the morning the following day. On the international front, a storm in southern Brazil has killed at least 21 people. According to authorities there, the casualty caused by this particular storm is the region's highest, with over 50 cities battered by heavy downpours and powerful winds. 15 of the 21 losses of lives took place in a single residence. Also, as of Monday evening, 1,650 people have been displaced. Now, pundits believe global warming is behind the tragic weather events worldwide in recent times. In Mongolia, Korean operatic pop tenor Lim Hyung-joo gave a performance this past Sunday following a mass by Pope Francis. On stage in Ulaanbaatar, Im sang 3 songs, including You Raise Me Up. The Pope also reportedly invited Im to the bishop's house in Ulaanbaatar a day after the performance that Im spontaneously sang Ave Maria in front of the Pope. Pope Francis has been in Mongolia since September 1st and is the first Pope in Catholic history to visit Mongolia.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the United States, the chairman of the Proud Boys, a far-right militant organization, has been sentenced to 22 years in prison for his role in the January 6 Capitol riot. Enrique Tarrio was given the sentence on Tuesday over multiple charges, including seditious conspiracy. This for attempting to forcibly prevent the peaceful transfer of power from then-President Donald Trump to current President Joe Biden. The 39-year-old was handed the longest sentence out of anyone who has stood trial in relation to January 6. Prosecutors had sought 33 years. Although Tarrio was not in Washington during the riot, he was found to have helped coordinate the group's involvement. He is the last of 5 Proud Boys to be sentenced. Other members received prison sentences ranging from 10 to 18 years. Cuba says it has uncovered a human trafficking ring recruiting Cubans to fight for Russia in Ukraine. The Cuban Foreign Ministry said on Monday that the ring is operating both locally and in Russia and is trafficking Cubans to fight in the war zone with the Russian military. The ministry did not specify who is responsible, but said it is trying to dismantle the network. This comes after social media reports by Cubans and Russia's military said they were tricked into joining and were being mistreated after refusing to fight. Russian media had also previously reported that Cubans were joining the fight in Ukraine in exchange for the promise of Russian citizenship. Cuba and Russia are longtime allies, but Cuba has stressed that it is not part of the war in Ukraine. Russia has not commented. The United Nations has warned that harvesting sand from the ocean floor is causing irreversible damage to marine life. It said Tuesday that sand dredging ships vacuum up some 1 million truckloads of sand a day. This also removes from the ocean the microorganisms that feed local marine life, causing major environmental damage that is difficult to recover from. The warning follows findings released by a new platform that monitors dredging activities. Marine sand is mainly used in construction as it's better suited than other types of sand. It's not heavily regulated, but some countries, including Indonesia and Thailand, have banned marine sand exports. And finally, less than 3 weeks after winning the Women's Football World Cup, Spain's head coach Jorge Vilda has been fired. Announced on Tuesday, his sacking comes amid the ongoing fallout over a kiss scandal involving the president of the Spanish Football Federation. Vilda has also faced criticism since last year, after 15 players left the team and demanded his resignation over a number of issues, including inadequate training techniques. The 42-year-old has been replaced by a former player, Montse Tomé, the team's first female head coach. Tomé had been part of Vilda's coaching team since 2018. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. It's early September and we don't usually expect to be under heat wave advisory around this time of year. However, much of the western regions is under a heat advisory with highs in the 30s this afternoon under sunny skies, except in East Coast regions with 5 to 20 millimeters of rainfall expected. Then Jeollado provinces and surrounding areas in Jeju Island will see passing rain this afternoon. Now, especially those in Jeollado need to be aware of heavy sudden rain. Meanwhile, coastal regions in Gyeongsang-do will be quite windy all day today with a wind advisory being in place. It's quite muggy in rain-affected regions with a high of 32 degrees in Gwangju and here in Seoul. Dazzling sun is shining down on the rest of the country with high UV rays, so sun protection items are a must, especially sunglasses to protect your eyes. Bright skies will stay with us as afternoon heat continues hovering in the 30s, but at least we won't struggle to get a good night's sleep due to the uncomfortable heat. Well, that's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That ends this edition of the Daily Report. Do stay tuned for Wednesday's edition of Issues and Insiders coming up next. Thank you for now.
Ireland, like Korea, is a very outward-facing country. Our peoples are curious about the world. Like Irish people, it matters to Koreans that your story is told well, that people understand your values, your culture, your perspectives. Arirang plays a really important role in telling Korea's story to the world and to promoting the Korean brand. This fosters closer friendships between Korea and other countries and enables better cooperation. Resonating with the world, Arirang.
Loved and watched around the world. We want to make more animations to reach more children. Traveling time and space. Developing adventure and curiosity. Infinite creativity and hope. We want our children to grow up to be happy. Animation, watched by children all around the world. So that joy can be felt when our animation is watched. This is the reason we make animation and share with the world. K-Animation, befriending children all over the world. Lotte takes a new leap beyond its boundaries. Our change will lead to better lives for all. New Lotte, the power of a better world. New today, better tomorrow. Lotte.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
President Yoon is poised to push for tangible action
against North Korea's blatant belligerence amid US intelligence reports that the regime is planning to seal a food for weapons deal with Russia. So what are the prospects of regional unity against North Korea's hostile intentions? What are the prospects of trilateral talks among South Korea, China and Japan within this year? And what is the relevance of global gatherings amid brewing geopolitical tensions?
Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we touch upon President Yoon Suk-yeol's latest regional diplomatic mission as he attends a series of ASEAN-related summits in Indonesia starting today before heading to India to partake in the G20 gathering later this week. For more on this, I have Jack Barton here in the studio with me. Jack, it's a pleasure to have you back.
It's wonderful to be back.
I also have Sebastian Folletti with us. Sebastian, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
Right, Jack, let's begin with what appears to be high on President Yoon Suk-yeol's agenda as he undertakes his latest diplomatic mission.
Well, we've already heard President Yoon addressing the South Korea ASEAN meeting, which is the bloc in just South Korea. And he made it clear that North Korea is right on the top of the agenda. There are other issues, of course, and there's a lot of areas he's seeking engagement in ASEAN: trade, supply line security, aid assistance, many other areas. But North Korea really dominated that address he gave to that meeting, talking about how it's an existential as well as a direct threat to the region. Of course, South Korea very worried at the moment. Also, Europe very worried at the moment, given that it looks like there could be a deal between North Korea and Russia to provide artillery shells. That's the expectation, which would make a big difference in the war in Ukraine. So it is an existential and direct threat to the world. Having said that, will he get traction there? There are a few reasons why it might not. One is because ASEAN is very focused on the South China Sea and Myanmar right now. Just days ahead of the meeting, China announced its 10-dash line, used to be a 9-dash line. This has really infuriated countries, including Malaysia, Vietnam and the Philippines. On top of that, you've got this ongoing, the coup, the result of the coup in Myanmar. And even though from the outside, we don't think it's a strong response. By ASEAN standards, they have had a very strong response, and that's sort of ongoing. And also South Korea. It was very ASEAN-focused under President Moon, but it's sort of stepped back. It's been Indo-Pacific, more engaged with the US. So because of those reasons, there might be some cooperation on smaller areas, but I don't think there'll be a big picture change.
Right. But broadly speaking, Sebastian, what does Korea look to gain amid stronger ties with the ASEAN in terms of security?
Well, like Jack just mentioned, we can see that President Yoon Suk-yeol is like revamping the so-called Southern policy that was advocated by his predecessor, President Moon Jae-in. So there is against at least the will to go south. And the main reason behind, the main rationale behind is that there is a fledgling relationship with China when it comes to geopolitics and economy. Geopolitics because there's a growing alignment with the US, but also economically because we're seeing China's economy stalling, which is a huge challenge for Korea because China is still the #1 trade partner of South Korea. So clearly the incentive to look to diversify your trade relationship is more urgent than ever. And naturally the South, ASEAN, 600 million people, a growing middle class, emerging middle classes, is offering a new horizon, at least a fresh opportunities for Korean companies to develop. They are already very present in some countries like Vietnam, where Korea is really has been focusing most of its investment, but also in Indonesia, income investment, but also, of course, it's a growing consumer market where Korean culture, Hallyu is very popular, so there is some opportunities there. But still, for South Korea, there's a choice to be made. It's like, until now, as mentioned, I mean, China was the key economic partner, and of course, the Indo-Pacific, the US alliance, Japan was also still the major priority when it comes to security. So the question is how much Korea can be seen as a credible, engaged partner with ASEAN. That's one of the questions.
Right, and before we advance any further, Jack, there has been quite a bit of question about the relevance of the ASEAN in recent years, especially given its lack of action, perhaps, with regard to Myanmar. You mentioned that earlier as well. What are your personal thoughts?
Well, it's funny you say in recent years. I realized before coming on the show, I've been covering ASEAN for a quarter of a century. And every single ASEAN, we ask the same question. Is ASEAN relevant? Does it actually do anything? And the answer is always yes and no. In the big picture, we never get bold statements out of ASEAN. We never get big policy shifting directions or a sort of a mass statement of condemnation on a certain act or really anything. But what we do get is incremental change, and we do get countries coming together and maintaining the status quo. And that's important in an area where there are a lot of territorial disputes and conflict over this and that. As the old saying goes, jaw is better than war. And ASEAN brings everybody together. And it is seen at ASEAN that it is very important to turn up, even if you're not a member, if you're part of one of the groupings. So it's right for Yoon to be there. And it will be noted that Yoon is there, and South Korea will be treated differently because Yoon has turned up. It's understandable that Xi Jinping hasn't turned up, given the kind of the shockwave China has sent through with the 10-dash map and probably the criticism, even, if it's muted and behind the scenes he would receive. There's probably a huge missed opportunity for Joe Biden not to turn up. Doesn't really matter much for ASEAN, but it'll be a big lost opportunity for the United States to kind of step in and say, okay, at this moment where you are a little bit divided and angry with China, here we are at this meeting. So really turning up is the important thing. It's getting that consensus on board, and President Yoon's definitely done the right thing to turn up, and probably, again, there might be some incremental benefits in terms of North Korea, things like interception of ships at sea that might be smuggling goods, cyber security, those smaller things that might not seem as important as some big announcement, but actually do make a difference.
Right. And in the meantime, Sebastian, on the broader subject of summits themselves, Seoul is hoping to host a trilateral summit among South Korea, China and Japan within this particular year. What are your thoughts on the prospects of such a trilateral meeting?
Yeah, looking a bit Northeast Asia again, exactly, we are seeing some signaling that finally the dormant trilateral cooperation could maybe come back into life slightly. Just to remember, this was launched in 2008. At that time, the three big economies of Northeast Asia commit to cooperate increasingly to make more pan-Asian coordination. But of course, all this has been stalled since 2019. There's been no summit, and at that time, the reason for this hiatus was the brewing tension between South Korea and Japan over forced labor history. So at that time, that stalled, and then we had COVID. So now we're, thanks to the better relationship between Korea and Japan, there is an opportunity to potentially relaunch this process. But there is a major problem, is that in meanwhile, the relationship with China has worsened seriously over COVID, and especially between South Korea and China, the relationship is increasingly sore because the current administration is also getting more engaged with the US. So the big question is to what extent China is ready to engage into that new process. So we know that there's going to be a senior official meeting of the three countries probably later this month here in Seoul under the rotating presidency to try to craft out the idea of having finally another summit, a trilateral summit again by the end of this year. So that's the goal. It sounds very ambitious when we look at the background, and when you see that even President Xi Jinping is not showing up at the G20, you wonder how you're going to bring these three leaders in the same room while they are disagreeing on some fundamental issue about the Indo-Pacific.
Right, and including, of course, the dispute between Beijing and Tokyo over the Fukushima radioactive wastewater. That being said, Jack, if a trilateral meeting is realized, what issues look to top those talks?
Yeah, again, that's a big if. As Sebastian was saying, it's going to be a process. There'll be that small meeting, and then if that's okay, there'll be deputy foreign ministers, and we're still a long way off. I think the most important thing about this, because of all of that, won't be so much what's on the agenda or whether they can solve big differences, is just that the meeting is happening again. That's a great thing. I covered the World Economic Forum for 7 years in a row, and every time I asked analysts there, where could be the big future flashpoint? Where could World War III start? Always the same answer: East Asia. Always. So that might have changed now with the war in Ukraine, but it was always the same answer, because you have this huge legacy issues, these territorial disputes, militaries acting very close to each other, and no coordination at all between any of the three. No hotlines, no anything. So big talks, big annual talks between the three, where people can sit in the room face to face, discuss ideas, discuss differences, and hopefully slowly move towards mechanisms. Obviously not something like the European Union or something the Europeans came up with in the wake of World War II, where a French person and a German can sit down for dinner now and talk about everything in the world except the war, or even think about it. But here in East Asia, all of those issues still burn bright, and there are no mechanisms in place. We desperately need them. So the meeting alone, if it can be realized, is a great thing, and it should be seen as a great thing. And you know, those differences which really tend to incubate, as we saw during the pandemic, when people are apart and they don't have that opportunity for face-to-face discussions, they can at least get together and sit down and talk. Will we get big resolutions and outcomes? Probably not, but at least the fact they're sitting down and talking means it can be put on the back burner for a little while, and that's a great thing in itself.
Right, hopefully, of course. Sebastian, following the ASEAN-related gatherings in Indonesia, President Yoon Suk-yeol is poised to head over to India for the G20 summit. Now, there he is expected to seek a resolute stance against North Korea's aggressive ambitions by calling for more action to perhaps curb its financing of its weapons technology. Do you, Sebastian, foresee a joint statement?
Well, I mean, in those kind of summits, there's always a very long joint statement. I mean, usually it looks a bit like a Christmas tree, because there's a lot of things hanging there. And of course, South Korea will be pushing to add a paragraph, or at least a line on the North Korean issue. The question is, the G20 meeting format is normally about mainly the global economy. It was founded to relaunch the global economy in 2008. So there's always an issue about bringing in security issues. Some members will argue that this is not the core issue that this summit should gather. But of course, there will be some push from other powers. So I think it would be possible to see probably a mention. But the question is, what would be the effectiveness? Because of course, what we are seeing today is increasingly a global community, a G20 that is divided between some Western countries with some emerging countries. The war in Ukraine has divided increasingly the grouping, and this G20 meeting is not even complete, since China will not even send its president. It will send its prime minister, Li Qiang. But the absence of Xi Jinping himself doesn't bode well for the outcome of this summit. Maybe there's a reason why Xi Jinping is avoiding this summit, while traveling as far as South Africa a couple of days before. But maybe he doesn't want to hand India and Prime Minister Modi a success on the global stage. Possibly that's one of the explanation. But it remains to be seen what can this G20 achieve in such a tense global geopolitical environment. So North Korea will definitely not be on the top of the agenda of this summit.
Right. You mentioned Ukraine, Sebastian. Now, France, for its part, has spoken about the need for a G20 communique condemning Russia's military confrontation in Ukraine. Do you care to elaborate?
Well, that's actually, I was at the G20 summit last year in Bali, and that was the main item discussed. There was this main battle between European, Western countries and US pushing to add the Ukraine war on the agenda, and then you had a lot of emerging countries there who say, well, this is not the place to discuss this. Eventually, they managed to come to a compromise where they mentioned the invasion of Ukraine last year. So this year, you could expect a similar kind of a battle. Of course, since there was a precedent, it might be easier to mention, to use the language you agreed upon last November in Indonesia. So it might be a mention, but again, for most countries around the table, the big concern is not directly the Ukraine war, it's more the stage of the global economy. We are most countries are facing increasing challenges, inflation, low growth, low export, the global demand is down. So I think that's the main concern, and so there is a risk of hijacking this meeting toward a more security-centric. So it will tell you how much the world is divided or united in this very challenging context.
Right. Prospects of a communique, the G20 summit, Jack, have been rendered uncertain by perhaps, according to pundits that is, India's strategic ambiguity with regard to the war in Ukraine. Speaking about that, with regard to strategic policies, the Yoon administration has been seeking a clarity, that is, in policy for South Korea. How has this shift in policy perhaps served South Korea's interests, do you think?
Well, it has given clarity, and in the region that's something unusual because there is usually ambiguity in statements and in policy, and there still is, it would have to be said. You know, if you compare it to, say, American policy, there is still a lot of ambiguity. South Korea has made a strong statement on Ukraine, for instance, and yet it tries to maintain ties with Russia, sort of, and it has moved closer to the United States, but at the same time it's trying to keep a close relationship with China. You know, there still is this ambiguity. You could just say it's slightly less ambiguous than it was before. There's a little more clarity. I think at the G20, because it's in India, and for many of the reasons Sebastian just mentioned, it's probably not going to make a big difference. You know, we talk about India's neutrality, but India's not really neutral. India just moves where its interests lie. So we see India joining the Quad, which is a little counterintuitive, but that's because it's having a major conflict with China, an actual conflict, you know, border disputes. There was a war in the 60s, and we've seen lethal engagements between Chinese and Indian soldiers. So it sees the Quad as something that's good for it. It's grouping with Japan, the US, and Australia. What's it going to give the Quad back? Probably nothing at all. India goes where India's interests are served, and looking at the North Korean issue, or what it can serve in a geopolitical sense for the Yoon administration, no amount of clarity from the Yoon administration is going to alter India's course on those issues. If it doesn't directly affect India, and this has been the way through the Cold War, you know, since really the birth of India. With some other countries, particularly with the closer relationship with Japan, it will make a big difference. But I think coming to the G20 summit, particularly because it's been in India, and I think that's why Xi Jinping's not going to be there, it is, don't want to put a feather in the cap of India, it's probably not going to make much difference.
Right. Jack, on a light note, during this week's diplomatic mission overseas, President Yoon Suk-yeol will also seek to rally support for Busan's bid to host the 2030 World Expo. Now, there is concern that the recent challenges faced during the hosting of the World Scout Jamboree, which we discussed about a month ago, I believe, may reflect negatively on Busan's prospects. Do you share these concerns?
I don't. The Jamboree was a disaster, but it was a poorly chosen piece of revamped swampland without trees, and then it got bad luck on top of that. So it was a bad choice, and then you had rains, you had a heat wave, you had a typhoon, you had so it was this combination of really bad events. But South Korea has a great track record of putting on big events and doing it really well. A summer and a winter Olympics and lots of other events in between. The big challenges the big challenge for Busan, and the reason why President Yoon is trying to drum up support, is obviously Saudi Arabia and Italy are also going for this, and Italy will have all of Europe and a lot of Africa behind it. So South Korea really needs to muster numbers and get other countries to come in and support it. The infrastructure in Busan, where they've said needs maybe a few more top-grade hotels, or the hospitality needs to change a little bit, but the basic infrastructure is fantastic. I'm sure Korea could hold a fantastic event there. the big challenge will be, can it get the numbers? Can it, you know, really, Italy, I think, would be the big one to overcome there. But that's the challenge. I think the Jamboree itself is not largely forgotten, but in relation to Busan, I think that's already largely a non-issue.
Right, we'll keep our fingers crossed for Busan then. Moving forward, Sebastian, despite the presence of these global gatherings this week, now some claim that global cooperation itself remains the biggest challenge to overcoming universal matters of concern, including climate change and food shortages. How do you, Sebastian, respond?
Well, we have seen the past few months around summer, all around the planet, that these heat waves, these climate disaster, increasing number of typhoons. So clearly climate change is getting into our daily life. It's becoming something extremely vivid to most of us. But having said that, we're also facing these major economic and geopolitical challenges, and the question is there a risk that might divert the attention? When we see global cooperation being challenged through this meeting with this geopolitical tension, it doesn't bode well to find an agreement, and more importantly, to advance the agreement that were made in the past few years in the Paris conference, Copenhagen, and how to implement it, because it's all about implementation, about the money you allocate. And of course, at the moment, increasingly population are suffering, tightening their belt. We can see even here in South Korea, exports are down. This is a global phenomenon. I'm just back from Europe. Also in Europe, inflation is spectacular. So the question is how long people can, you know, normal man in the street can hold this. And of course, for government, you can expect in the coming months and years, the focus is first of all to meet this demand from their population, especially if you want to be re-elected. So there's a big question about whether, climate change can be still a top priority. And then you add, of course, the geopolitical tension. We know that between US and China, which are the two biggest emitters, still, I mean, climate change issue still seems to be stuck. We've seen John Kerry, Special Envoy on Climate, finally making a trip to Beijing last July in order to relaunch that conversation with China. But still, we can feel that, at least on the Chinese side, there is this idea that this is part of a bigger negotiation, and climate change is one item that could also be turned into a leverage if needed. So there is a lot of concern about whether you can actually push further that item in the coming months.
Right. Hopefully they will be able to in the near future then. All right, Sebastian, thank you so much for your insights. And Jack, as always, thank you very much for your time and thoughts.
Pleasure.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. As always, thank you for watching.